Well, thank you everybody for coming today. We are very happy of hosting the presentation by Ariel Athwal-Yap from Maynooth University, Conceptualizing Singapore's Detention Painscape, Trauma, Identity and Resilience. Ariel has done her PhD dissertation around these topics, and we are very, very happy that she accepted our invitation to share her thoughts on her very, very interesting research. So Ariel, in general, we will give you 30 minutes, around 30 minutes or so to present your ideas, and then we will engage in Q&A. So thank you again very much for accepting our invitation.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, thank you for organizing this, and thank you everyone else for taking the time to be here today, taking time away from the sun if you're over up in the north. Yeah, so I'll just go straight to it. The issue with political imprisonment, or what I often refer to as indefinite detention without trial in Singapore, continues to be a controversial and contested issue. So this form of detention was introduced during what is better known as the Malayan emergency. So some of you might know about that, if there are any historians here. The British colonial government introduced this administrative power in 1948 in the region, so in Malaysia and Singapore, so what was known as Malaya or the Straits back then, to protect their own business and trade interests. So I've taken away some graphic images, but I might describe some of them. So there was a lot of fighting, and they deployed a lot of troops and those sorts of things. They're trying to battle the communists, those sorts of things. So if you can imagine that in the background going on during this time, and that was after World War II as well. So that's what was happening in the region during that time. And to quote legal scholar Jyoti Raja, the Malayan emergency allowed for the deeply undemocratic foundation of Singapore to be masked by the appearance of democratic legitimacy. And that's the end of her quote. So as you can see from the slide over here, that says temporary emergency powers. So administrative detention continues to operate under several pieces of legislation today. So I can't really keep up with the number of pieces of legislation that are being passed by the state, because it can be passed in a matter of weeks or a month in Singapore, but I've tried to update it as best I can. So these are some examples of Singapore's robust rule by law policy. And that appears to be a rule of law, but I argue it's a rule by law that operates within the state's dichotomous legal regime, which is modeled on the shell of the Westminster system. So just a quick note to provide some of you with the historical context, like I mentioned before briefly, about Singapore's social, legal, and political landscape. Singapore's colonial start can be traced to the landmark date of 30th of January, 1819. And I note that generalizing its beginnings to this date and the date of Singapore's independence, which is officially the 9th of August, 1965, however, risks oversimplification of Singapore's culturally diverse and elaborate history. Unfortunately, we don't have time to delve into the historical, social, cultural, political climate of Singapore today. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about this, as these factors continue to be very significant in shaping the detention painscape, which I will be focusing on discussing in my presentation today. So there's policies in the later half of the slide that states like post-independence 1965. So they are the successors of the emergency regulations that I mentioned at the start of the presentation. So these policies seek to target different social and political issues. They also contain similar forms of administrative power to detain a person before and or without trial indefinitely. So this legislation ultimately comprises Singapore's larger social control institutions, which seek to silence, neutralize, criminalize, and punish dissent. So today's discussion will focus on 3 pieces of legislation that are highlighted on the slide in red there. So Emergency Regulations of 1948, Preservation of Public Security Ordinance, which is also known as the PPSO, passed in 1955, and then the Internal Security Act, which I refer to as the ISA, which is pretty much the same. So it's stated twice because that was part of Malaya, and then when Singapore became independent, it was exported. But Malaysia and Singapore, they had very similar set of policy until recently. So these 3 pieces of legislation allow the state to detain people who are suspected or accused of subversion, radicalization, or deemed to be a threat to national security. So in terms of the geopolitics of this region, Singapore and Malaysia were part of the same state from as early as the 1300s, as indicated by historical records. So the same legislation, as I mentioned before, remained in Malaysia and was recently repealed in 2012, and now it's called the Security Offences Special Measures. But it's also quite similar, even though they say it's counterterrorism, they have also detained politicians and people who are called political dissidents under this act. The Malaysian government has also done similar things. So another thing to note is also that indefinite detention without trial during this period of time from 1948. So this book here says 1948 to 1960, but actually from 1948, and I argue up to the I would say 1990s, close to 2000, like right before 2001, they continued to detain people for like national security, mainly the threat of communism, socialism, Marxism, those sorts of things. So the official state published figure for political detention between 1959 to 1990 is 2,460. This number continues to be refuted. So, for example, the Singapore Political Detention Victim Network states that during this period of time, at least twice as many people were detained as has been acknowledged in Singapore Parliament. So that number is the only number that's officially acknowledged in Parliament to this day. I think they acknowledged it last year. So archival records of British colonial state-issued banishment and detention orders provide a more accurate picture of the extensive use of political detention within Singapore. So the Malayan British colonial government detained and banished 13,000 trade unionists, politicians, lawyers, journalists, academics, civil rights activists, student leaders, social workers, and any other individuals who were deemed to be associated with the left-wing movement during this time. And on the other hand, so this was happening at the same time, 650,000 to 1.5 million people, including women and children, were uprooted from their homes and placed in detention camps, which you can see on this book cover here, which was written by historian Tang Ting Fee. He talks about the villages, which is what the British essentially called detention camps, where they kept these women and children and men and people taken from their homes and placed in these camps indefinitely to combat the threat of terrorism and communism in the region. So in order to understand these harsh realities that we faced in the region, I interviewed 135 people about their experience or the perspective of political detention in Singapore. It is important to center a research analysis on the voices of marginalized and victimized people. As such, I conducted oral history interviews and follow-up interviews, as well as open-ended correspondence from 2019 to 2020. I also provided participants with the option to review and edit their transcripts. And I developed this method after reviewing my fieldwork notes and reflecting on my previous interactions with participants. So my use of follow-up interviews was also based on the participants themselves and gatekeepers. So the 135 people I interviewed included former detainees, family members, friends, colleagues, neighbors, and other community members. And honestly, I initially intended on interviewing the former detainees themselves, but my decision to interview family members, friends, colleagues, neighbors, and other members of the community was very incidental. So as you can imagine, many of them were getting on in age, and I felt I was very lucky to be able to interview people who were detained from 1948. And, you know, they were well in their life and they wanted to speak about their experiences and share that with me. So many of them aged 80s, 90s. So that meant that I had to travel to their home sometimes. So what would happen is I would be sitting in the living room talking to them, and they would be saying something, and their partners or their children will be chiming in from the kitchen or the study as they walk by, going like, no, you told me this, or you're missing that, you should tell her that. And eventually they just sat down for the interviews, and that's how it happened. So I went back, you know, I amended my ethics application and never really looked back. So I now think that it is very important to include these perspectives because these experiences do not occur in isolation. Many people around the globe define their identity and experiences in relation to multiple social group belongings and collective social units. So these were the 3 research questions I formulated in order to understand how state power shaped and continues to shape both individual and collective experiences of harm. So the experiences and harms resulting from this violent practice are best understood within what I call the detention painscape, a painscape that remains very much embedded within the penal architecture of Singapore. And what is this painscape, you might ask? So adopting the concept of detention chain, penal chain, and pain from Layla Skins, Andrew Wolf, Didier Fassin, Niels Christie, I aim to better the understanding of how legal, administrative, and social processes come together to generate a series of cumulative pains that intersect and overlap to create a vast detention painscape, one that impacts people beyond the boundaries of time and borders. So I rely on Niels Christie's definition that the state manufactures and routinizes the infliction of pain. And in the case of Singapore, these actions were hurtful and they were experienced as punishment by political detainees, by their family members and members of the community. While Niels Christie's concept of pain allows for the understanding of how these punishments hurt, how they feel, the suffering, the sorrow, Skins and Wolf's concept of a chain allows for the identification and exploration of how different links of administrative power impact Singapore political detainees, their families, and affiliated social groups that they belong to. I also analyzed each interaction through the lens of pain delivery, a concept adapted from Diarmaid Harkin's 2015 study of police powers. So overt and implicit modes of pain delivery embedded in Singapore's experiences of political detention were identified in the process. And the broad conception of painscape also allows me to identify the continuum of harms that inform detention experiences and shape the life course of participants some 20 to 70 years on after their period of detention. So this extensive painscape ultimately resulted in traumas that persist well beyond periods of confinement and continues to impact many of my research participants, as well as the wider Singaporean community to this day. So before I move on to an illustration of Singapore's detention chain, which effectively comprises and makes up this far-reaching, timeless, and borderless painscape, I would like to contextualize the plural and collective nature of identity and belonging in Singapore. So as opposed to more individualistic notions of identity that appear to be more common and dominant in Western Anglophone societies, many people in Singapore define their identity in relation to multiple social group belonging. So this includes belonging to religious, work, school, or other cultural or social organizations. And this difference is critical to understanding the experience and resulting harm from detention. So for example, something that has occurred, in the policing link of the detention chain, which I will show in the next slide, it doesn't just accumulate it doesn't just occur in isolation. It accumulates and interacts with the other links that occur in this painscape, in this chain. And that person's experience could also intersect with the fear, pain, and or anxiety experienced by another person who, for example, goes to the same church or the same mosque or the same temple. They might not necessarily know each other, but they might go to this same mosque or temple, for example, and they can feel that shared experience of pain, fear, or anxiety. So a lot of statements and thinking along the line of like, instead of this happened to this person, which is at first what happened during the interviews, but then eventually the narrative develops and they start talking about why are they doing these things to us? These things were done to us, to our group, to our school, to our family, and so on. So you get the idea. So my research participants often perceived and experienced these powers as highly punitive as well, mainly because these state measures aim to deliberately inflict different forms of pain, including physical, psychological, and emotional pain, and shame as well. So these are some detention links that I identified in my research. So the round links such as interrogation, torture, forced confession, all these links comprise a detention chain. We might not have time to go through all of them and how they interact and types of impact they have there, but I put them up there so you might be able to start to understand and visualize how the specific links from different intersecting trajectories they can impact the detainees, family members, friends, inner and wider social circles, as well as Singapore community. So younger people who might not have lived during that time, they hear these stories and they do experience that, and that also affects the way they interact or participate, interact with police or participate politically or socially in activism, for example. So it is important to note that as a result of forced migration, banishment, and exile, the Singaporean community exists both within and outside Singapore borders today, which is one of my arguments that it is borderless, because there are many different diaspora migrant communities internationally. So in Australia, it's one of the larger groups. Like in Malaysia, it is probably the largest group. In many other parts of Asia and in the North as well, in the UK and different parts of Europe, Canada, and America. Those are some examples of the more notable diaspora migrant groups or exile groups that have formed as a result of this. So I'll give you a minute, maybe a few seconds to take in these tension links before I discuss some of the main research findings. So I'm just going to talk about this person who was detained. His name is Yongray, and his account illustrates how different links operate within a painscape that hurts and harms him and his family. So Yongray was 26 when the officers raided his home. In the dark of the night, they bashed through the doors, seized all his personal belongings, put them in black plastic bags, took him in front of his parents and his siblings, who were also home at the time because they were sleeping. And none of his family members knew where he was for nearly 6 weeks. They were only allowed to visit him about just under 2 months after he was taken. And I quote his sister here, who just said that they disappeared him and he vanished, during this time. So during that time, he was placed in solitary confinement. He was interrogated and tortured. And because he was accused of acting, and I quote the official response and the order that was issued, acting in a manner prejudicial to the security of Singapore by knowingly assisting in the resurrection of the Communist United Front, which is known as the CUF, and indulging in activities in furtherance of the communist cause, end quote. So he was kept indefinitely in detention because of that for nearly 3 years. They still have not produced any other evidence than his own forced confession to date. So when I interviewed him in 2019, he described how these traumatic experiences impacted him, his family, his friends over the last 5 decades. So this is a quote in which I think like best describes and represents how he felt after he migrated from Singapore to Canada, about 20 years after he was released from detention. He said, "I was lucky enough to be granted the opportunity to move overseas for my work. When that opportunity came, we, my wife and I, grabbed onto it. Thinking back, even though I was in detention for a relatively short period of time, my children were thankfully too young to remember, but it did affect me, our marriage, and my family." So his family meaning his parents, siblings, cousins, and uncles, which he spoke about during the interview, so deeply. When I got off the plane, it was like a breath of fresh air. I could breathe again. I could walk down the street without having to look over my shoulder. But whenever I come back or I read the news about what the Singapore state is doing, it brings me back down to this reality. Now when I visit, I see how so many others, friends and family members, continue to be affected all through their old age, end quote. So if I could draw your attention back to the links on the slide here, keeping Yong Rei's statement and his experiences and account in mind, we start to see how these different links come together to impact Yong Rei and his family's experience. It affects their ability to recover or even unhook themselves from the reach of the detention chain, even as they rebuild their life in Canada. So a very crucial and significant link, police powers, which includes surveillance, routine questioning, searching and seizing of personal belongings, and short-term custody. Very common powers that are still used by the police in Singapore to this day, and the police elsewhere across the globe. If we just think about that link, for example, in the context of detention, it is important to note that many participants, including family, friends, and colleagues of political detainees, were being followed by plainclothes police officers, and they also had their belongings seized, and they were also brought in for interrogation themselves. These experiences often added to the feelings of fear, paranoia, and anxiety, especially because many participants felt that they were being harassed and intimidated and stigmatized instead of feeling safe and protected by the police. So we start to see how these police actions, so early on in the detention chain, they created and they continue to create a sense of insecurity within individuals, their family groups, their neighborhood, and the community. So crucially, these feelings accumulate as each detainee progresses across and through the different links in the detention chain. All these modes of pain delivery resulted in significant loss, harm, and suffering experienced by detainees, their families, affiliated groups, and members of the community. The accumulation of this had ultimately resulted in legacies of trauma. So like Yong Rei, his wife, their parents and siblings, and members of his former workplace, many other men, women, and children continue to be affected by the legacy of detention. This traumatic legacy remained an important part of their identities, and it continues to shape their experience and interactions with social processes that occur in Singapore. And these shared memories of detention and the knowledge that the practice endures continue to evoke fear, doubt, and anxiety within Yong Rei's familial, work, and social friendship group. So feelings that they grapple with as they strive to rebuild their lives and recuperate their losses. So the legacies of trauma link may not be as explicitly violent, but it is nevertheless very critical within Singapore's state detention process I conceived the legacies of trauma, the resulting hardship, and diminished quality of life, prospects, and prolonged suffering to be a crucial aspect of the Painscape. So these traumatic legacies are a result of the many physical and psychological injuries that political detainees acquired from different intersecting encounters with Singapore's detention chain. And most notably, my research findings indicate that these harms not only continue to affect many for the rest of their lives, but the resulting pain is often transmitted between family, friends, and within generations in the same family or social group. So in this instance, my findings are similar to research on military veterans' children of their parents' experience of post-combat PTSD, which often resulted in parenting patterns that were characterized as controlling, overprotective, and prone to emotional unavailability, avoidance, or reaction. Even though existing military studies indicate avoidance in parent-child relationships, my research findings indicate that avoidance was displayed by former detainees and other adults in the household. This correlation indicates the amount of trauma experienced by family members, which appeared to operate both during individual interactions and collectively across adult-child interactions. So similar to international psychological findings on post-conflict victim survivors, Singapore former detainees and their families commonly presented co-occurring conditions, including post-traumatic stress disorder, complex PTSD, depressive disorders, panic disorder, substance-related disorder, psychotic disorder, adjustment disorder, generalized anxiety, panic disorder, and suicidal tendencies. So my discussion revealed that resulting trauma, helplessness, and insecurity, anxiety, and severe psychological distress subsequently impacted the physical and mental health of participants, many of whom continued to require medication and professional support at the time of their research interviews. Vitally, these violent practices often accumulated and resulted in prolonged traumatic stress and non-fatal suicide attempts and suicide deaths, which impacted detainees and their family members both during and after periods of detention. And these traumatic effects demonstrate the far-reaching impact of Singapore's detention painscape on families and the wider community. And the tragic occurrences and succession of pain also underline my argument that family members should also be conceived as victims of Singapore political detention. It is also therefore just as important to better understand collective and accumulative pain in Singaporean families, social groups, and communities as it is to understand former detainees' experience of pain and trauma, especially because pain and trauma are often shared and transmitted between members of these groups, and because experiences and identity are collective rather than individualistic within the context of Singapore culture. So I hope that this project lays the ground for further work on state power and the experiences of individual and collective trauma, mainly because my research highlights the critical need to consider the ways in which states reify punitiveness and hurt in the broader community through the relational exercise of power. Based on my findings, I call for these practices to be abolished and accounted for. These practices remain embedded in many structures of confinement elsewhere that can be readily identified in many other prison and detention facilities around the world. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing what you think.